Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and this is the final in a set of lectures about adolescent development, adolescent pathology, and psychotherapy. I would like to address now the question of anorexia and bulimia. This is the last of the several specific psychopathologies that adolescents frequently endure, and it's a particularly important one because it is so dangerous. It is statistically one of the highest, has the highest morbidity rate, which means, and I've read various figures, 12%, 15% seems consistent in the literature, up to 15% of women diagnosed with anorexia end up dying from complications related to their self-starvation. So along with major depressive disorder, which sometimes results in suicide, anorexia is a deadly illness that has to be dealt with at the level of meaning. You can, and this is a disorder in adolescence that I think parents and administrators become so intensely emotionally reactive to that they very frequently cause more problems than they're solving. Why won't she just eat something? Make her eat something. Talk her into eating something. If she just ate something, everything would be fine. Of course she must eat something. And everyone knows exactly how to fix the problem. She's supposed to eat something. And thinner and thinner and thinner she becomes. Oh, by the way, this is almost entirely a female disorder. There are very rarely any males diagnosed with anorexia. I've worked with one or two, and I've seen colleagues who have worked with a couple of others, but again, stats are impossible to come by accurately, but it's got to be 99% plus exclusively a female gendered diagnostic category. Okay, back to the she must eat. The reason that is so painfully unhelpful, and in fact the very part of the problem, is that people who see anorexia see it as she's losing weight because she's not eating. They see the solution, make her eat. They don't understand the meaning of her starvation, her self-starvation. There's been tons of really good research on this subject now, and I will quote or take from three of them: Sarnoff, Aronson, and Giovacchini. I've sort of integrated their ideas on this. One of the things Sarnoff says is that what happens is in the adolescent girl, early adolescent girl, we have the realization of budding sexuality. This is traumatic to young girls who are not ready for it and do not have a way of thinking about their budding sexual adolescence as a good and developmentally necessary thing. It becomes traumatic, it becomes terrifying. So in a way, the losing the weight is a return to the sexlessness of latency. They disqualify themselves as an object of approach. They become like 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds again in terms of their body shape and appearance. I think of it as a rejection of sexual development. In the fantasies of some adolescent anorexics, there is an association with pregnancy, that fat equals pregnant, which evokes I think that's a derivative of the basic trauma of sexual development. Adolescent girls, boys as well, but in this context, adolescent girls can feel disruptive anxiety around their adolescent sexuality. If that inevitable anxiety is overlaid on a foundation of anxiety generally, of inadequate psychic structure, we have a prescription for an anorexic teenage girl. The literature is clear that there is some element of conflict with the mother in this around control questions. Sarnoff is also one that suggests directly that there is a masochism and depression in anorectics that is hidden, that is in fact used as a mask to basically reverse the control question, that there's a type of victory in their starvation that can mask a masochistic or depressive dynamic, in part because they're getting something out of their suffering. They're victorious over the controlling parent in some ways. And the tragedy is, if that's all she has, then death is on the doorstep. One anorectic said, well, a therapist of an anorectic said, not eating is all she has. If the anorectic is left with that, then left with starvation as the unconscious only source of her own control and power and efficacy. If not eating is all she has, then she's doomed. And the therapy of the adolescent anorectic has to be directed at that deeper unconscious meaning of the eating, and not some sort of controlling, strong-arming to get them to eat. The very thing they're fighting against, control, is what the vast majority of people in their lives try to do when they become anorectic. It's the very thing they fought with the anorexia to begin with. And the whole process is doomed to miserable failure if that's the direction the family goes. As part of the masochism and the depression of the anorectic, which seems quite prevalent, one of the bits of literature that Sarnoff talks about is, in some ways, in some anorectics, there's an element that good therapists can tease out, where it seems like the anorectic believes they don't deserve to live, that it is, in fact, a slow suicide. Now, in my research on suicide, what I have found, and those suicides which I have personally investigated while I was in the military, and there were several, I inevitably found, and it seems to me the literature would support, that there is an element of revenge in every suicide. A suicide, whether it's depression-related or a slow suicide through anorexia, seems to be often, not always, but often, tied to a sense of powerlessness. And the death is, at some psychic level, symbolized as a great act of revenge against the parents. The fantasy in the mind, and it's mostly unconscious, it seems, in both the major depressive disordered patients and the anorectics, is that the fact of the patient's death will inevitably, in the mind of the patient, be seen by the world as an accusation against the parents. And they get great emotional satisfaction in that feeling of revenge. And they won't give it up easily. They won't give it up at all if it isn't addressed honestly as a source of their behavior. Side by side with that are the internalized objects that are hated. This not just suggests a revenge against the external actual parents, it suggests an act of revenge against the internalized parents. That you take in the parents, as I've said before, and if you take in something of a hateful object, you can hate yourself, and self-destruction is a way to wreak savage revenge upon the very thing you hate about yourself. At that point, internal and external become very confusing. And very troubling for both the therapist, the patient, and the family. Let me turn to several quotes that a survey of the literature by Aronson has highlighted. Quote, "These patients, the anorexic ones, have been attached to a domineering and controlling mother who attempts to attain passive submission and perfection for the child as her own fulfillment. Power and control exerted by the omnipotent mother is overwhelming, remarkably interfering with separation and individuation in all phases of the child's development. If that's the case, then the anorexia is the last desperate attempt of the child, now adolescent, to control something in her life outside of the mother's domain. And the sad truth seems to be, in some cases, that the starving adolescent girl, the only thing she's ever allowed to control, the only thing she ever has the power to control, is the food that does not go into her mouth." More. Identification without mirroring translates developmentally into a split-off sense of specialness combined with an excessive compliance, a collusive bond between mother and child, which is reminiscent of what Greenacre calls a focal symbiosis, a relationship in which there is a, quote, pathological union of the child's special needs with the parent's special sensitivity, unquote. Within this collusive bond, compliance fosters subordination of the child's self to the subservient position of a narcissistic extension of the mother. The daughter perceives her mother as experiencing increasing difficulties mirroring any thoughts, feelings, or actions which differ from the mother's. And we see mothers whose daughters have anorexia who increasingly need their daughters as a narcissistic extension of themselves in order to feel whole and alive. Bulimics, by their use of and abuse of food, are attempting to make of food a reliable transitional object as a way to undo the mother's frightening unreliability. Lastly, the anorectic struggles against feelings of enslaved, manipulated, and exploited. She believes that she has not been given a life of her own. She wants to establish a survival system. Her goal is power, expressed by a grand gesture that gets its energy from the fact that it is difficult to stop anyone from starving herself. She wants to avoid any kind of accommodation to the demands of others, contrary to the compliant, sweet posture she maintained in her early childhood. As her flesh falls away, her soul is revealed, made free again, given shape and nourished by a diet of primitive anger thinly disguised, by a falsely appealing, chic narcissism masquerading as Puritanism. That's complicated, but what it means, I think, is that the young female adolescent is left with nothing but starvation to feel efficacy, to feel control, to feel alive and separate from the mother, whose overwhelming narcissistic needs required the submission of her daughter to her own perfectionistic dynamics. This is a poisonous dynamic at its absolute worst. The best summary of the anorectic dynamic is by Giovacchini, the best I've ever read. Again, forgive the reading, but this is essential, and anyone dealing with an anorexic or bulimic patient needs to get this at the most profound level if lives are going to be saved and not destroyed. Quote, "Two themes emerge in the review of the literature regarding the etiology, that means cause, of anorexia nervosa. One, conflict regarding the patient's capacity for individuation and for resolution of the mother-infant symbiosis. And two, feelings of loss of control of her capacity to determine her own life." Here it is. All published reports which consider the importance of family relationships in the development of the syndrome stress the significance of the mother's personality, life experiences, and relationship with her daughter from birth through adolescence as the most critical factor determining the daughter's development of anorexia nervosa. To summarize features observed repeatedly in these studies, we can describe a hypothetical paradigm. The mother of the typical anorexic patient is an emotionally immature woman who feels that she received poor maternal care herself. She was, and continues to be, dependent on her own mother, a controlling woman who provides criticism but little support, and who feels an obligation to direct her daughter's life. This issue of control reaches a climax with the prospective patient's birth. At this time, the mother's mother attempts to run the family and to care for her daughter during her confinement and the immediate postpartum period, while, at the same time, remaining aloof and critical of her daughter's child care attitudes and practices. The daughter feels unprepared to become a mother and resents having to care for another while she herself still wants to be cared for as an infant. It goes on, but it seems to me that the theme here is unmistakable, that in this particular diagnostic category, probably more clearly than in any other, we have a stark juxtaposition of the child's own real, honest, reality-based developmental needs being derailed in favor of those of the mother, directly, repeatedly, and quite literally from birth. It's an astonishing thing. Okay. In conclusion of the psychopathology section, all diagnostic and statistical manual categories are a derivative of some form of parental failure to meet the true developmental needs of the child. That is true. That is reality. We now must take another deep breath and remind ourselves that that is not an accusation. It is not a charge. It is not the pointing of a finger with fault. It is, this is the key here, folks, it is an opportunity to step up, mature, do the right thing, and take an honest level of responsibility. If you're listening to this lecture, if you've made it this far, then my assumption is you recognize as a parent, if that's who's listening to this lecture, you recognize as a parent that you have done things perhaps that you should have done differently, might have done differently if things had been done differently with you. And folks, that puts you in the top 10% of the healthy parents. You need not, and I'm going to do my best here to convince you, if that's possible, to not feel guilty, to not feel overwhelmed, to not feel like you're a failure as a parent. If you can feel that this material has evoked in you some sense of responsibility, then instead of more self-punishment, which I suspect you've done enough of already, thank you very much, you can take a deep breath and recognize this as the road toward the future, not wallowing in a destructive, dangerous, difficult path, or past, but the idea that this material might open up avenues that will allow you to put your mask on, to heal your wounds, to recognize patterns that will allow you then to take responsibility for your adolescence, healthy development. In my field, this is profound wisdom. It is better late than never. And I say that to my 60-year-old patients. I say that to my 70-year-old patients. It's a bit of a stretch at that point. It is not a bit of a stretch for parents with adolescents right now. Better late than never. Adolescents want to get better. They want to get stronger. I've never had an adolescent patient who I didn't see at some level the desire to grow, the desire to flourish, the desire to be more than what they think of themselves as now. Parents who can use this material to overcome their own guilt, their own shame, their own insecurity, their own sense of their own inadequate ability, all of the pathologies we deal with every day, all of the dynamics that every human being on this planet, me included, has gone through and struggled with. If you recognize in this material your humanity, not your condemnation, then this material may be used to make the changes necessary to stop the intergenerational transmission of trauma. How should parents proceed? With courage, with some understanding now of the truth of their own life and the truth of that of their children, with courage and strength, and a commitment to perhaps a newfound sense of truth, then therapy with the family and therapy with their patients and their own lives and that of their adolescents can be dramatically better. That is my sincere hope. Okay, part 4. Let's talk directly then, having sort of understood adolescent development, adolescent psychopathology. After a basic introduction, we now are at section 4, therapy with adolescents and their families. All right, here's how I think of this. There's good enough parents. And that idea of good enough is an idea from Donald Winnicott. The idea that we don't have to be perfect to be good enough. And the perfectionist idea is actually a symptom of a kind of pathology. Being good enough isn't a low standard. It doesn't mean we can be lackadaisical. It is actually a very high standard which requires our best efforts, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm shooting for parents in the good enough category, what I will call the middle category. On the left, we have negligence. We have parents who either don't care, are too depressed, have whatever issues, they're negligent, they're not there, they're not present, they're not actively engaged in struggling with their adolescents' developmental needs, for whatever reason. On the other side, I'm going to put the controlling, abusive parents, this is the mothers of the anorexics. These are the controlling, abusive fathers who demand compliance and obedience. I put those on the other category. neither are healthy. What we find is that some parents who have had a negligent parent can become over-controlling because the chaos is so painful. And then we find some adult parents now who had controlling parents who, because that control and abuse was so painful, they swing over to the hands-off, negligent, let them do their own thing category. And we end up with generation after generation swinging to the extremes, and everyone's forgotten, if they've ever known, what it means to be in the middle and take care of the children's needs. So I want to pull all of these parental behaviors back into the middle and attempt to help both the parents and the adolescents figure out how to get better, stronger, more adaptive, and healthier. To find love. That's what therapy's about. To be able to find and to develop a way to be strong enough to deal with the internal anxiety, a way to be strong enough to deal with life's inevitable external anxieties, a way to be able to develop healthy human relationships from the perspective of health and wholeness and integration, basically to be able to achieve an ongoing, long enduring sense of love and connection with other human beings, whatever that looks like. Okay. Step 1, family systems. You cannot fix an adolescent without addressing the parents' reenactments of their own developmental progressions, failures, derailments, and strengths. I think that's the bedrock of it. Parents have to be involved. That should be obvious by now, but I also want to add in this part the parents' strengths, because parents, if any parent listening to this lecture is a parent with enough strength to deal with most of the adolescent's difficulties, to deal with enough of their own. The parents that are hopeless are the ones who don't take the time to get the help, who don't even recognize there's a problem, who think that either negligence or controlling and abusive parental behaviors are just the way things are. That's just the right way to do things. That's the way things are. Well, that kind of parent would have long since turned this lecture off. My assumption is anyone who's still listening cares enough, are themselves healthy enough to be able to tolerate this sort of difficult idea or ideas and have some ability to take this material in and help their adolescents. There's strength in the parents as well as the difficulty, because what we're talking about here is good enough, not superhuman, not perfect. We get to make mistakes, and I have had this experience all the time as a therapist and a good chunk of the time as a father. The idea that a parent who can make a mistake and allow that mistake to be understood as a mistake by the child, and who then acknowledges that mistake, who repairs the damage and makes a good faith commitment to do behaviors differently. You don't just redo it over and over again. You slap a child, you say, I'm sorry. You slap a child again, I'm sorry. You slap a child again and say, I'm sorry. This is not an apology. Without structural change in the family dynamic, apologies are worse than meaningless. They become part of the traumatic experience that derails development. So what I'm suggesting is that the strengths that parents bring to the table don't have to pretend mistakes aren't going to be made. When I work with a patient and I make a mistake, which happens all the time, and the patient calls me on it. It happened recently. A patient was in my office and I was talking too much. You might find this hard to believe, but I was talking too much. He would say something and I would add something to it, and what ended up happening was he started to feel impinged on, overwhelmed, controlled. And what I was doing was trying to help him understand the good things about what he was doing. Given a history of extremely controlling and abusive parents and abandoning parents, he was attempting to sort of get some help, and I was trying to fill up that vacuum with good things. Turns out I was reenacting the trauma. Instead of helping him grow from the inside, I was simply trying to fill the void with my good things, and that can't work. So I made a mistake, and when he sort of named his frustration, I realized it right away that I had pushed too hard, and I backed off and I apologized. It was my mistake. I apologize. I see what I was doing now, and I think I see why. And we talked about how that happened. how he does things, how I do things a little bit, how I was pulled into this dynamic, which is my responsibility not to be, but I was in it, and then I recognized it and pulled out and named it. And he felt so understood. He felt that he had, and he felt safe enough that he could name it himself. And I think that experience, which I've had many times in therapy, because I've made lots of mistakes, and I've tried to catch them, and sometimes, thank God, my patients help me catch my mistakes. To name those mistakes as a parent, and then to honestly see them because you do your own work, then to be able to change your dynamic in the family, and the children slowly, though they don't trust it initially, come to see you as a different, better parent. That's transformative in the child, and here's why. A child who sees a parent make a mistake, who acknowledges the mistake, will take in the idea that it's okay to make a mistake, that they won't be abandoned, they won't be hated, they won't be rejected if they make a mistake. Therefore, they don't have to pretend they don't. And the delusion and the denial and the projections that requires, if that delusion is to be maintained, and it must be maintained in that kind of scenario because the child's fear of abandonment is the worst and most absolute fear. So it is a great gift for a parent, and I'm saying this now because I want to encourage parents who are listening to this to recognize, A, how much courage it takes to do this, but also the fact that admitting a mistake is actually one of the central vehicles for healing in the child, in the adolescent, and I think, frankly, in the parents as well. I don't think it can be done without those things. Okay, so I come to this field of study and the field of therapy with a strengths-based approach. Across the banner of my website, it says the only cure is strength. I believe that. I think every adolescent wants to be stronger. I think every parent at the end of the day wants to be a stronger parent and a stronger person. What does that mean? What does strength mean? Strength means feeling that your needs are met, sufficient to contain the anxiety, internal and external, strong enough to manage reality in a way that's adaptive and effective, strong enough not to have to resort to dysfunctional defense mechanisms like denial and projection and splitting, all of those dynamics that we all do now and then, but we all recognize if we're healthy that that's not an effective adaptive strategy to pretend things are real when they're not. There is truth, there is reality. Defense mechanisms hide those things from us because we're not strong enough to deal with reality. The line from the old movie, "You can't handle the truth," turns out to be true in most of our cases. Therapy is about becoming strong enough to handle the truth of our lives and our families. Okay, for the adolescent, if there's a problem, we have to ask the question, if kids want to be strong, and they do, what's standing in their way? What's standing in their way internally? What anxiety, what are the fantasies that represent the anxiety that's inhibiting them? Externally, what are the problems in the outside world? There will always be those. Can the parent help? Is the parent part of that external problem that has to be modified first? The answer is yes, always, without exception. Okay? I like to help adolescents and their parents build skills as well. What skills don't they have? Most importantly, why not? Take an inventory. What language skills does the child have? Adolescents today often have a very difficult time in speaking English appropriately. Probably all adolescents always have. They speak colloquial. They speak with idiomatic expressions. Why? Because it's cool. Because they're in the know. Because that's what their group speaks like. And they don't speak the King's English, and they don't sound like they're academics from four-year college. So there's some of it that's just normal development, but some of it is a skill. They need to be exposed to language training. They need to be exposed to good books and good media that facilitate the development of language. Parents can help that at some level. If they're not developing language because their unconscious dynamics are too drenched in anxiety, then giving them a good book is not going to help at all. It will, in fact, make it worse, because the child, adolescent, will simply be frustrated at not being able to grasp something that it thinks the parent expects them to grasp. It makes it worse, it doesn't make it better. Obviously, one of the skills the adolescent needs is emotional regulation. Guess where they learn that from best? If the parents have no control of their emotions, that is what the child is taking in. If the child doesn't have emotional regulation, guess where they learned it? They have taken in the dysregulated parent. That has to be addressed. How? By the parents becoming more emotionally regulated themselves. If you think you can make a child settle down in class and stop being disruptive, when it comes home to parents screaming and yelling at each other, you're more delusional than you can imagine. Doesn't work that way. I would suggest the same thing's true for social skills. If the child's parental environment is filled with aggression, hostility, and conflict, how can you expect them to get along with others in the sandbox or in the classroom or anywhere else? The atmosphere in the home is what teenagers have taken in. It becomes who they are, and if it isn't changed as a system, then the adolescent is not going to change. They may grow up and leave home, and they will take that dysfunctional system with them into their adult life, and most of the time repeat the same patterns that they were trained with. With any luck, they'll recognize it, have courage enough themselves, and get the help they need to change whatever their parents do after they move out. Here's a good one. Besides language, emotional regulation, and social skills, how about motivation? How do you think about your teenager's motivation? Are they motivated, yes or no? Inevitably, there is a sexual component to the adolescent's motivation. They're becoming sexual creatures. I encourage you to take a look for the details of this at the book, The Sexual Relationship, by David Scharf. I've given a 3 or 4 lecture series on sexuality on the website. I won't go over it again. Here's the biggest problem with adolescents and their motivation. Adolescents are perceived by parents frequently to be lazy. He doesn't work hard enough. He just doesn't apply himself. He's not motivated. It isn't that they're not motivated. They're scared. They fear failure. They assume failure. They don't work because they assume that they'll fail and they'll be criticized for it, so they stop trying, because better to be criticized for lack of motivation than be condemned and abandoned as a failure. It's ironic. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy half the time, but one has to be clear that it's a question of strength. If I were to tell a parent in my office, go lift that 1,000-pound rock, and they looked at me like I was crazy, I would say, well, they can't. I can't. I'm not strong enough. If I were to say to them, well, you're obviously a loser. You're obviously mentally ill, they would think I was. Psychology has the same idea. If parents expect teenagers to do things they're not emotionally strong enough to do, then the idea is to help them get stronger, not condemn them as pathological or lacking motivation or morally corrupt, even worse, or condemned in some other way, not living up to the family standards of success or whatever nonsense the parents are spewing. The idea is, if an adolescent has a problem with motivation or in these other areas, it's not because they have some disease element. It's because they are afraid. It's because they're not strong enough, because their anxiety has been overwhelming developmentally. Help them get strong enough to lift the emotional equivalent of a 1,000-pound rock. That's the goal. Okay, a 500-pound rock. And I will say again, why diagnosis is critical. You cannot fix it if you don't know how it's broken. And I want to reiterate, none of the psychotropic medications is going to have any effect on an adolescent's mental health. It may numb a symptom for a time, but it will fix nothing and will likely exacerbate the underlying problem if there isn't some directed effort at psychotherapy for those developmental needs. In order to do that, the parent must stop trying to control the behavior, must stop trying to get the adolescent to merely comply with the social demands of the milieu that they are in or the family they are in, and must ask the all-important, courageous question: what is the meaning of the behavior? not just what they're doing, but why. If you don't understand the meaning, this goes back to the idea of teenage behavior as a symptom of distress, as a signal of distress. They're telling you something when they act out, and you've got to understand the meaning of the thing. It's not the thing, it's the meaning of the thing. And if a parent doesn't get that, doesn't translate that into something in the adolescent's mind, then whatever they do is going to be a misdiagnosis, and it will almost invariably cause more problems than it solves. How many parents have tried to do something and it hasn't worked? So what do? They try the same thing more. They become more aggressive. They become more controlling. How does that work? As poorly as it did the first time. If it doesn't work, maybe it suggests that the approach isn't adequate. Maybe something else should be tried. Maybe something else needs to be understood. That's the right approach, it seems to me. All right, now, the right approach. Here's the trick. There isn't a right approach in large part. Being responsive to the hand you're dealt. Being responsive to the particular adolescent. There is no, this is important, there is no magical cookie-cutter response to ADHD, anorexia, depression, or anything else in an adolescent. Complexity of the human mind is the norm. This is why there are no causal, direct, scientifically provable links between any neurological, biological, genetic, hormonal structure and any human behavior. Because any human behavior is the sum total of multiple inputs from multiple layers of development. Complexity is the norm. There are layers of meaning and conflicted motivation to every human behavior, and that's why I don't believe there will ever be a direct, clean, genetic discovery that leads to a particular behavior. There will never be a neurological structure that can be identified, a neurological pattern that results directly in a particular behavior consistently to any scientific satisfaction. None, zero. It will never happen. It's not the right solution to the problem. No two kids are the same. Therefore, no two solutions are going to be adequate. And the great old saying, no two children have ever been raised in the same household, is absolutely true here. One child's experience as the first son is going to differ dramatically than the fourth child, a daughter's experience in that same household. Those two kids were not raised in the same household. And therefore, the solution to their problem has to be seen within them, not just what they're doing. It will mean something different. Even if they're doing the same thing, it's not going to mean the same thing. And therefore, the therapist and the family must recognize that the intervention has to be scaled, has to be structured to deal with the particular diagnosis of that particular kid in their particular developmental history. Now, there are consistencies. We have a human nature. There is reality. There is a consistent genetic biology. All of that's there. There are complexities, but they're not random. Childhood development proceeds in a particular way. If it doesn't, there is some kind of pathology. It matters how you raise your children. It's got to be within some fairly broad, but still parameters of appropriate and normal parental behavior. If you don't, if you have some subjective experience that you're doing something new and radical and different, and it's okay that you do X or Y or Z with your children, you're likely to generate pathology in those children if it's outside the last 100 years of research on what's appropriate for the developmental achievement of a healthy human mind. We know, in large part, what children need. That's no longer a mystery. And there are limits on what any parent can do, and it doesn't matter what your expectations are. It doesn't matter what your desires are. It doesn't matter what your political philosophies are. Your political philosophies do not matter. if they are outside the norm of human adolescent behavior and development. If you're facilitating pathology, you're wrong. You are not dealing in reality. You are not respectful of the truth of your or your adolescent's developmental life. Okay. I actually heard on the radio not that long ago an ad that said, if you listen to this DVD, I will show you how to solve any adolescent behavioral problem in 10 minutes. Just follow this system and everything will be fine, and you will get compliance. He actually used that word. You will get behavior, you will get respect, and you just have to follow these X number of steps and everything will be fine. And I thought that was on the verge of being a criminal fraud. And I thought, how could any parent listen to such nonsense and send them the required money? And my conclusion, the sad conclusion I came to, is that, well, there must be a lot of desperate parents out there who would fall for such an obvious fraud. Behavioral algorithms and rubrics will not ever work in the complex mind of an adolescent. You've got to tailor them to the individual adolescent a little bit within broad norms. To believe that you could change behavior in 10 minutes by following steps 1 through 7 is, I'm not sure which is worse, that it might be a fraud or that it's so ridiculous. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about what parents and therapists do that might be considered a bit of a mistake. So let's get some of this out of the way first. Number 1, talk too much. Parents talk too much. Therapists, myself included, sadly, all too regularly, talk too much. If you can listen empathically, if you can get your own anxiety out of the way, if you can sit and with, again, some benevolent curiosity, which withholds judgment and actually is interested in the response and the context, you will find that that by itself is often quite therapeutic. Being in the presence of a loving, curious mind, being in the presence of a stable, calm, understanding mind who does not judge, condemn, prescribe, impinge, control, that by itself is often quite healing for an adolescent from a parent or a therapist. So take a breath and hold your opinion for a while till you've thought about it. Hold your opinion till you've allowed your adolescent to say something, and then pay attention to what might be underneath that. If you keep getting in content arguments, and the worst example of this is politics. Teenager comes home all fired up about something political that the parent disagrees with. Parent reacts with shock and horror that they're Democrats and and the kid comes home with some Republican thing, or vice versa. It doesn't matter. It's all pathological. The idea that we get lost in the content. Well, I hate this politician. I think he's great. I think she's terrible. I think she's the best. And we get into a substance, content argument over politics, when what's going on is a desperate need for care and love. What's going on is a desperate need to be acknowledged as a separate person. And if you don't get that to start with, all you're going to do is re-traumatize the kids. You get to be curious about how they came to think that way. How interesting. I don't think that way, but tell me about how you think that way. If you can hold your own anger, anxiety, and reaction, you might just have an interesting result. Okay. Therapists often take too much history. They want to get into the nitty-gritty details. For quite some time, I asked patients, both teenagers and adults, to write a little biography, a little this is your life sort of biography. Didn't care if it was 10 pages or 2 pages or whatever. Just give me a little background. And I'm not sure that's a good idea. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not sure. One of the things I do know now is that history will come out between the therapist and the patient. That everything of importance is right here, right now, that the patient will reenact its childhood, will in the transference put the therapist in the position of the parent, and the therapist, if they're sensitive, will feel The experience of what it's like to be that patient, will feel what it might have been like to be that patient's parent, will recognize the meaning of those things and help the patient understand the meaning for them. Listen. It's all right in front of you if you have the psychic structure, strength, and courage to listen. If you have the strength to hear your adolescents, they're halfway to healing, I think. All right. Do not ignore, the third problem, do not ignore the physical problems. And this would include smoking, drugs, alcohol, diet. There is no separating the mind and the body. If a child is obese, if a child is addicted to alcohol or any kind of drug, if there are other issues around body issues, and there are always issues around body issues with adolescents, then that has to be addressed directly. Is the child getting adequate nutrition? Is the child using food as a substitute for emotional healing? Is the child getting adequate exercise? Is their body getting stronger while their emotions are getting stronger? You can't have it either or. It's got to be both. Every adolescent needs some program of exercise, both for their body and their mind. I've already beaten to death, I think, the idea of responsibility. But the one thing no one can do is blame anybody else. We can't blame society. We can't blame the parents. We can't blame culture. We can't blame racism or capitalism or societal prejudice or misogyny or misandry. We can't blame any of the social dynamics that what I would call the grievance industry now so easily and quickly capitalizes on. At the end of the day, it's just about us and our kids. We've got to take responsibility for that. There's no projecting the anger, the anxiety, or the hate out on any other group in society. We have to recognize what's true for the patient in the here and now and stay in that here and now if we're to make any difference at all. It is so easy in a paranoid way to project all that anxiety and hate out onto some alternate other, some other group, whatever it might be. I think that's probably the classic sickness of our modern era in some ways. Stay in the issue of what's true for the patient, what's true for the parent in the here and now moment. And it isn't going to be because society is messed up. It just isn't. And here's the extra little responsibility along those lines for the adolescent. I may hold parents' feet to the fire on the responsibility question, but guess what? What does it mean to be an adolescent? It means taking increasing levels of responsibility. If the adolescent is acting out, then he or she has got to take responsibility for that. That's the whole point of adolescent development. Plenty of responsibility, not blame, plenty of responsibility to be had in the adolescents themselves. And it makes sense at some level, carefully and slowly. Again, the 1,000-pound rock analogy. You can't expect a 14-year-old to take total responsibility for their life and self-care. That's not realistic. That would be neglectful, if not abusive. But you can expect them to do a great deal, and you can expect them to do more than they did when they were 13. That's the balance. That's the middle ground. That's the good enough parenting I'm talking about. Yes, adolescents are increasingly responsible for their own behavior. They're increasingly responsible for the consequences of their actions. And therapy is in some way helping them take charge of their reactions, owning them, being strong enough to translate their unconscious experiences into conscious awareness, and maybe for the first time in their life, an honest choice instead of just a repetition of the parental dynamic. Mostly on the side of the parental spectrum involving the negligence or the loosey-goosey kind of parents, I find fairly consistently parents trying to be too nice. I think there's a swing away from the authoritarian parent of 30 or 40 years ago now to the more sensitive parent, okay? So is it good? Is it nice to neglect a problem when it's right in front of you? If what the parent is doing is colluding with the teenager's pathology, It's destructive. It's not nice. It's pretending to care while avoiding any actual responsibility. I had two sets of couples come into my office recently. They had between them a daughter and a son, and the mother and father were divorced, and they'd remarried, and so they were their son and daughter had some problems. They were mid-adolescent, and they were trying to get some help. And it turns out that both the son and the daughter had a pretty serious marijuana problem, like daily use. And the parents were sort of, it's not as bad as meth, and I went through that phase when I was a teenager, and they were very lackadaisical about it. And what I saw happening in their adolescence life was a dire problem, which they, being so nice and gentle and respectful and of choice, they just didn't want to address. And I looked at all four parents right in the eye, and I stopped and I looked at them and I said, "You are killing your children directly with your being nice." And I meant it, and they were shocked, and I think to this day I was right. And I think that's one of the hardest things. I get abusive parents in all the time, and I call them on their abuse, and we struggle with the meaning of it, and it's difficult to take responsibility for that when they realize the meaning of it. What's harder, I think, truth, if a parent is slapping their child around, it doesn't take that much to show them that what they're doing is acting out their own childhood rages. Most of them get it fairly quickly. The problems I've had have been with the parents who were so nice. They want to be nice, and they can't imagine that what they're doing is hurting their children. And what they can't imagine is how much rage is underneath all that niceness. That takes more effort to get at. And I think in my case, in my patient's case now, what I see way too frequently is the problem on the negligent and over-nice parental. They think they're doing the right thing. They're trying so hard to be good parents. And what they're doing is catastrophically abandoning their children. That has to be addressed. So being too nice, colluding with anyone's pathology is not helpful. I'll say it again because it needs to be said. Drugs cannot cure any mental illness ever, and that we had better be aware that symptom relief versus healing the underlying emotional problem has to be juxtaposed as clearly as possible. The labels that get thrown onto adolescents now, the labels because of drug use, and I mean prescription drug use, authorized drug use, which is not really use, it's more imposition. The labels that the adolescents put on themselves, I'm broken, I'm diseased, I'm unfixable, I'm unlovable because of medication use, when the medication never actually fixes the problem and everybody knows it, is one of the most serious problems in my field now, I think, across the board. All right, so to wrap this up, a conclusion. I think this entire set of lectures has been a plea. Desperate plea, maybe at times seemingly a desperate plea for love, for truth, for understanding, for responsibility, for help. Help for the parents, help for the adolescents. I want to finish with one more summary, one more conclusion around the question of truth. Because I think if you don't really get this, then none of the things I've said today make as much sense as they might or be understood at all. And I think this highlights what I'm suggesting as well as anything I've ever read. This is also Robert Caper in his great book, Building Out into the Dark, and he's quoting Bion. In his book, Transformations, Bion attempts to explore the relationship of psychoanalysis to truth by delineating the difference between propaganda and the explorations that lead to truth. Wow. All right, you got to get that. Patients who get told by their parents what to do in a direct, controlling, impinging way are being given propaganda. They're told that if they do what the parent says, they're good, and if they don't, they're bad. Now, I get boundaries. Parents have to impose boundaries. Kids need boundaries. But there's a certain element of moralism in a parental approach, and here's the key, in a therapeutic approach. A therapist, frequently, who isn't him or herself well well analyzed or had enough of their own therapy to see this happening, will do the same thing. They will, especially with adolescents, will start telling the adolescent what to do. They'll act just like the parents. That is doomed to failure. That is propaganda. What's going on in the child's mind? Can the therapist be curious about the meaning to the patient of what's going on without telling them what to do, without directing them, without requiring that they do anything? An interpretation is supposed to just evoke in the patient some understanding of an element of their mind that they did not know before. It is not, it cannot be, it should not be a moral bit of persuasion, an attempt to get the patient to comply with the parents' or the therapist's ideas of what's right or wrong or should be done or should not be done. This, to me, is central and perhaps the most profound element of psychotherapy with adolescents and maybe with anyone. Bion continues, the analyst's position is akin to that of the painter who by his art adds to the public experience. Since psychoanalysis does not aim to run the patient's life, but to enable him to run it according to his lights, and therefore to know what his lights are, the analyst's interpretation should represent the psychoanalyst's verbal representation of an emotional experience. This verbal expression must be limited so that it expresses truth, without any implication other than the implication that it is true in the analyst's opinion. So true about what's going on in the patient's mind, not some all-knowing therapist who claims to know right and wrong and good and bad and trying to impinge into the patient's integrity and integrity and power and control them, impinge on them in a way that's demanding compliance with behavioral strictures, moral strictures. Analysts must make, according to Caper now, analysts must make clear that they are only rendering an opinion, thereby undermining the patient's idealizations of their words as revealed or absolute truth, an idealization that places analysts in the position of an archaic superego, and that not only relieves the patient of the need to think any further, but also inhibits the patient from doing so even if he wants to. This is huge. Listen to this again. Run it back and listen to it again and again. What happens is that if the therapist, in his or her sort of arrogant all-knowingness, tries to manipulate, propagandize, impose, direct the patient on the moral rightness, wrongness, goodness, badness, do this, don't do that, of what's happening, the inevitable reenactment of the parental dynamics is itself inhibiting the patient's ability to think for themselves, which is the only route by which strength happens. Parents, same idea. If you can, with some benevolent curiosity, recognize what's going on and attempt to understand what's happening in your adolescent's mind, and frankly, if you don't understand what's going on in your own first, you can't do this at all, then we have an opportunity here for tremendous growth. If we can hold back the moralization and look at discovering what's inside the patient's mind. That's good therapy. That's the truth that we need to head at, the truth of the patient's mind. Okay, this is about the patient's integrity. This is about the child's integrity. Bion again. How is truth to be a criterion to what has it to be true, and how shall we decide whether it is or not? Falling back on analytic experience for a clue, the problem arises with schizoid personalities in whom the superego appears to be developmentally prior to the ego, and to deny any developmental and to deny development and existence itself to the ego. Okay, what a complicated technical language. I apologize, but what he's saying here is so central. The idea that if you preclude a patient or an adolescent from thinking for themselves, from exploring their own mind, if all you're demanding is compliance, if all your impinging control is designed to do nothing but enforce compliance with rules, you're undercutting the very process that is necessary for the development of the adolescent to achieve anything like meaningful autonomy in adulthood. And it suggests that the therapist that does that, or the adult parent that does that, has themselves not achieved a sufficient level of their own independent emotional and intellectual autonomy. Caper again. Bion's axiom implies that the search for truth is as vital to the mind as the search for food is to the organism. Anything that seriously threatens the search for truth threatens the life of the mind. That's it. So that truth is to the mind what food is to the body. Lies to the mind are what poison is to the body. You will derail, you will generate pathology if you lie to yourself, if you're not strong enough to handle the truth of your experience, if you're not strong enough to help your adolescent handle the truth of his experience, to recognize his internal psychic structure, his emotional response, the meaning of his behavior, not just the behavior, but the meaning of it. Get at that, and there is growth. Get at that, there is strengthening. Enough of that, and there is love and strength enough to live a healthy, adaptive life, to stop the intergenerational transmission of trauma, to achieve a kind of long-term, loving relational dynamic. Also a creative, professional dynamic. These two things are intimately connected. At the end of the day, this approach results in almost an existential awareness of the meaning of life, of the sense of self as grounded in loving relationships. It gives a way to channel creative energies. It gives a way to sublimate sexual and aggressive energies. If the adolescent has derailed sexual and aggressive energy, it's going to come out somewhere in pathology. Figure out how to channel their energies. Channel them, not extirpate them, not punish them for having sexual and aggressive energy. Help them understand the meaning of those things and channel that beautiful energy into a type of aliveness. Every therapist who sees a patient who gives an appropriate interpretation will see in that patient a little spark of aliveness, a little spark of, yeah, that feels right, a little empowerment, a little sense of their own efficacy and power, and it feels good. It may not be a big thing, just a little hint. But if parents can see that in the eyes of their children, if they can see it in themselves, that this really is about facilitating a true self that has been there since infancy, possibly even before. That our goal as parents and as therapists is to facilitate the true self of our children and our patients in a way that gives them a sense of spontaneous aliveness and power and strength and capability and confidence. If we can do that, it is a miraculous thing to behold. To sit with an adolescent, a young adolescent with a history of trauma and difficulty, and over the course of often a long time, see in them a little spark of aliveness that's like fanning a little flame, to see behaviors change, to see growth happen, to see relationships deepen, makes all this pain and suffering that one has to go through to do that worthwhile. It is the meaning of the thing that makes the effort worthwhile. I commend this material to you. I wish you and your adolescents strength and health and much love. Thank you very much.